So how is ADHD diagnosed? And the other very common question is there a test? Now, the way to diagnose ADHD is basically to gather information on the development of the child and to observe the child, to gather information from their parents, but also other persons who know this child, so teachers and other informants. So the diagnosis, as with other common conditions in psychiatry, think of depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth, is really made based on the interview and gathering information and the assessment, the exam. Now, I would like to highlight here something which I think probably is the most common mistakes that early career professionals who deal with this tend to make at the beginning when they're not very familiar with ADHD. And it's the fact of saying, well, I saw this child in my office 40 minutes, it was very calm actually, and parents told me he can focus on video games. So actually I think that after my initial assessment, I rule out a diagnosis of ADHD. This child does not meet the criteria. So this is a mistake because, as I mentioned, children with ADHD can pay attention in particular situations. So more than the direct observation in a specific context for a limited period of time, it's more important to gather information from persons who see this child daily and for long periods of time. Because making diagnosis or ruling out a diagnosis just based on a short observation can be quite misleading. Now, are there tests for ADHD? The answer is no. And it's not surprising because actually if you think we don't have any other test, when you go to see a doctor for depression, they don't make a test or any kind of test. And this is the same for ADHD. Now, some of you, I guess, may be familiar with the questionnaires that we use to gather information on ADHD. These are called, for instance, Conners, SNAP. There are many others, but these are probably the most commonly used. So I would like to stress here that these questionnaires are not diagnostic. So we don't make the diagnosis based on the result of these questionnaires. These are meant to gather information and also to monitor over time the severity of the symptoms. So we ask the same person, give me your impression, tell me on a scale from 0 to 5 how distractible this child is before the treatment and after the treatment. But we don't rely exclusively on this for the diagnosis because, of course, these questionnaires are completed by individuals who may have some issues themselves, for instance, mental health, or may not know the child well. So, for instance, if we ask a teacher who sees this child on a Friday afternoon from 4 to 5 during the week, this is probably not informative on how the child is during the week. So we really need to make sure that we consider this information, but we don't use it for the diagnosis. Is there a genetic test? The answer clearly is no. As I mentioned earlier, there are no specific genes for ADHD. And it is important to be aware of this because on the internet, there are a number of companies which provide genetic tests for the diagnosis of ADHD. But this is not grounded on solid scientific rationale. Can we do an MRI, so brain imaging, a picture of the brain to diagnose ADHD? Once again, based on what I mentioned earlier, the answer is no. This is done in research study when we compare groups of children, but at the level of the individual child, this is not helpful because there are no single alteration of the brain that are big enough to say, this is characteristic of ADHD. Finally, do we need a blood test? Usually we don't. We may request blood tests sometimes to make sure that we don't miss other conditions which may look like ADHD, and also to assess, for instance, iron deficiency, which may be a risk factor for attention problem, may make attention problems worse. But routinely we don't ask for blood tests.